So, let me tell you about my great-grandmother. She was the only one I actually met from the generation preceding that of my parents. There was my grandmother in the USSR, Louise, but there is simply no way she could have escaped the circumstances she found herself in, having been exiled to Kazakhstan and all. We were, after all, bound to be political exiles and worthy of being worked to death. Katherina Ens, with only one N, and not two as is the fashion today, later to be Redekop, was born on January 24th, 1875, in Plum Coulee, Manitoba. If nothing else sets this lady apart from the thousands and then millions of women who helped build the prairies, the name of her hometown is memorable. Her parents, Gerhard Ens and Maria Heide, had made the long trip from Sparrow, Russia, where they had lived on the fringes of the so-called Molochna colony. There seems to be some dispute as to exactly what day or what year Katherina was born. However, according to the 1901 census, 1875 is the year that she had at some point claimed. Later, in 1936, when she returned from having lived in Mexico for about 8 years, she needed to tell the provincial officials something. It's at this point that her birth year was relocated to 1877. It could be that the earlier date was one of convenience, since that would have meant that she was married at 17 and not 15. Oddly enough, the 1921 census has her born in 1876. There may be some other explanation for it, but I simply believe she didn't care about when she was born or how old she was. Whatever way you wanted to look at it, she was already the mother of 3 by the time she was approximately 19 years old. If you want to follow up on my research into this grand old lady, you are more than welcome. However, you need to be aware that her married name appears in various forms, depending on what any given census taker heard on any given day. One of the bolder variants of her married name was Redikup, Redekop. It seems that my people were always a bit of a mystery to these Englishmen traveling the countryside during the census time. They ran into a people who claimed to speak German, of course. It was no form of German that they had ever experienced before. They had, for the most part, come from Russia, and not Germany, with their ancestors having spent a few hundred years living in and around Danzig and its environs under the Polish crown. It was not made any easier by the fact that many of these people's ancestors had actually come from other parts of Europe, mainly what is today the Netherlands, Schleswig, Holstein, Mecklenburg, and other parts of Northern Europe. Needless to say, something was going to get lost in translation, and German was an approximation at best. I really don't know what you would have made of her. She was not only of another generation, in my case 3 generations distant, but someone almost 150 years removed from who we are today. As a young girl, she would have seen things that we can only vaguely imagine. I've seen the Métis buffalo brigades as they started out across the prairies in consternation, wondering where the once plentiful bison had gone. They lived on what was once the edge of where these great herds had migrated. She would have heard vague rumors of a Louis Riel when she was about 9 years old. In 1899, she moved with her husband, Jacob W. Redekop, to Hague, Saskatchewan. Of course, it wasn't Saskatchewan at the time. She was moving to the Northwest Territories. At this point, she had been 6 years married and had 3 children, with 11 more to come. They finally settled around Warman, Saskatchewan. That is north of Saskatoon and, at the time, very much the edges of what might be construed very loosely as civilization, provided one considers whatever then existed around what is today Saskatoon to be civilization. The reality is, they were simply pawns in the Canadian chess game called Confederation and Nation Building, with the Métis and the indigenous people of the Northwest. They were to serve as the buffer between what the Canadians considered the hostiles and the desirable English settler further to the south. They were to demonstrate that the white man had indeed arrived and was not going anywhere, and were to also absorb any casualties if it went that far. Trina's people had not been part of the conversation that took place in the perhaps not-so-hallowed halls of our nation's capital. Just to give you an indication of how far out on the edges of Canada they happened to live, it was only about 70 kilometers south of where the last battles of the Northwest Rebellion had been fought just a few years before in 1885. It seems, in one way or another, our family's lives were powerfully intertwined with rebels of various kinds, stretching over hundreds of years. Not that we were rebels necessarily, we just ended up being quiet witnesses to their doings. Now, what can I tell you about her? She was quite blind by the time I knew her, and her hearing was minimal. She could make out the lower registers of the voices of the husbands of many of her granddaughters, and those of her grandsons as well. She had trouble with the higher voices, and I think sometimes she couldn't hear us children at all. With the noise we made, perhaps deafness was a blessing. More than anything else, I can remember her hands. We would be sent into her room at the Salem home in Winkler ahead of our parents. It was as if they thought they needed to cut us off from retreat at the sight of this really old person. When she realized that we were in her room, we were expected to present ourselves to her. It was as if she needed to have us pass a test of one sort or another. As the matriarch of our family, I think she understood this to be her right. Outstretched hands awaited us as our parents firmly held our shoulders and pushed us even closer to the strange being. I would say from another world, but that would have been stating the obvious. Considering her age, she was from another world. She would chuckle to herself, and her hands would tremble with excitement. She did not have any tremors in her hands normally, so I have to assume it was with excitement at seeing us. And I say seeing us in quotation marks. Her hands would flit dance-like up and down our bodies, touching us randomly, running her palms and fingers across our faces and then into her eyes, touching the corners of our mouths. Always it ended with her hand on top of our head, as if to determine exactly how tall we had become. She would always comment on our size. "Du bist so groot geworden," she would say in her native Plautdietsch. "You've become so big." I would always answer quite willingly in Low German. It was only later, as I grew older, that I adopted High German exclusively. Oddly, the High German would always please her, though she herself limited herself to Plautdietsch, unless we were singing hymns or reciting Bible verses. I remember those hands as being so big and so soft. It was as if our being was enveloped in clouds of misty flesh that entered into our very soul. She almost always knew who was before her simply by touch. Her hands were her memory. There was one time when we visited her in the middle of the afternoon in the middle of summer. She was working in the home's garden. I spent the rest of the day having sand and soil combed out of my hair and my mother spitting on her handkerchief and getting the smudges off of my face. Being blind, she couldn't see that her hands were dirty, and being old, she couldn't remember that she'd been working in the garden in the dirt. I do remember my indignity at all of this, since I had been forced to take a bath before we went for our visit. We often would sing hymns to her. I was one of the few who could do this because I was one of the few cousins who had any fluidity in High German, and was thus able to sing the songs that she desperately craved. In this whole process, she would interject between the songs and verses and recite entire psalms from memory. This was the only time that I ever heard her speak High German. There was one visit where I had taken it upon myself to try to borrow the hearing trumpet from one of the other elderly ladies. Yes, I still lived in a time when you ran into the occasional person who didn't actually have a hearing aid, but used something that looked like a reverse megaphone in order to hear what was being said in a conversation. It looked like one of those trumpets that you see on the old phonographs, like the one into which the dog is barking in the old RCA logos. I had always wondered why she didn't have one, or at least didn't find it necessary to have one. I was convinced that it would help. In reality, I just wanted to be sure that she had actually heard my voice for once. She died in 1975, in September. The funeral was in Morden, Manitoba, and there was a huge turnout. At her age of almost 100, one would think that most of her friends had already passed on. In fact, they had. It was the first time I saw exactly how immense my extended family was. It filled a church that could hold between 400 and 500 people quite easily. Even then, there were people left standing in the foyer. Cousins, second cousins, and other people we met for the first time as relatives. I say that because I had already been friends with many of them, but now discovered that they were actually family, too. My Uncle George came from Calgary and stayed with us. He talked to me about the importance of family because I did not want to go to the funeral. The reason for that was that there was a leadership camp on that weekend that I wanted to attend. It was my first year as Sergeant of Battalion 3454. I didn't go. I went to the funeral and had the honor, together with my Uncle George and my cousin Richard Schultz, of helping to lay her to rest one last time. I was permitted to carry her casket to its final resting place in Rheinfeld. It was a last kind gesture from me to her, and upon reflection later in life, to myself as well. In all of this, the one thing that gave me pause was looking at her in repose in her casket. Her hair streamed down over her shoulders and disappeared into the bottom of the coffin. I'd never seen her with her hair down. It was so white and so fine. It almost looked like fine silk and begged to be touched and to have one's fingers run through it. But this was a funeral. Time left to linger over goodbyes and return the gentle caresses I had received from her, to touch her face in return and probe her soul, as so often she had done to me. I had only known her as my great-grandmother, a connection for me to a time I could not even fathom. I had never known her as a woman, a girl, with dreams and hopes and love. That was now, in this final moment, revealed to me.